I had never stayed up so late working, but I knew that if I wanted to make my suadero and al pastor taco business successful, I had to stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning every day. I had already picked a spot on the road closest to my house, because I noticed a lot of people passing through that area. The first week went really well, especially on Saturday. That day, I started setting up my stand at 6 p.m., and by 7, I was preparing the meat and everything else. By 8, I started selling, and just as I expected, customers started pouring in. I was alone at the time. I couldn't afford to hire help, and those 4 hours felt exhausting because there were so many people. It was past midnight when the flow of people on the avenue slowed down. Some still came, but not as many. By 4 a.m., everything was dead silent. Not a single soul passed by. I was about to pack up when a drunk man showed up and ordered 2 servings. He started talking to me about his life, his family, and his problems. Those 2 orders lasted him an hour. It was 2 a.m., and he was still talking, but both of us fell silent when we heard a child's laughter. The man I was talking to stopped mid-bite, and we both looked around, surprised. The man said, "There's nothing around here, right?" I looked around too, but didn't see anyone. The man, still startled, asked, "Do ghosts haunt this place?" and then continued talking to me. However, seconds later, I saw a little boy arrive and sit at my stand, next to the drunk man. He smiled at me, and I smiled back. I asked him why he was out so late and if he was hungry. He said yes, so I gave him 2 tacos. A few minutes later, the drunk man asked for the bill, paid, and left. I stayed with the boy, asking him where he lived. He pointed to a 2-story house across the avenue. When he finished his tacos, he got up and ran toward that house. The next Sunday, I set up my stand again, and the avenue was empty by 2 a.m. That's when the little boy returned. This went on for a whole week. Dieguito, as I started calling him, would come back every night at 2 a.m. But there was something strange about him. I never saw him cross the avenue or leave his house. Every night was the same. I'd hear his laughter, and then he'd come out to greet me. One Sunday around 11 p.m., while serving the same drunk man from before, I saw a couple come out of Dieguito's house. They approached my stand and ordered 2 servings and 2 sodas. As they ate, I asked the man, "Are you Dieguito's father?" He said yes, his voice trembling. I warned him to be careful because Dieguito had been sneaking out every night at 2 a.m. The couple started crying. I apologized, thinking something had happened to him that day, and asked if they were okay. The mother, devastated, told me that Dieguito had passed away 2 years ago. He was hit by a car on that road, and his body was thrown to the corner where my stand was. I was speechless. I had seen him, and the drunk man who was eating was a witness to it. That's why I asked him if he remembered that day. He said yes, that I was indeed talking to someone, but there was no one else at the stand, certainly not a child. Dieguito's father told me that a neighbor had mentioned hearing their son sometimes at night, and that once, when she looked out, she saw Dieguito playing on the road in the middle of the night. That night, I felt so much sorrow that I didn't even charge them and packed up early. The next day, I couldn't believe it. The boy didn't look like a ghost or how I imagined ghosts to be, but while setting up my stand, I had always noticed a cross on the sidewalk but never paid attention to it. That afternoon, I went over and read it. It had Dieguito's name and the date of his death. The truth is, ghosts scare me, and since that night I always pack up before midnight. I don't think I'll ever close later than that again. That's all for tonight, audience. Good night. I'm going to tell you a story that fascinates me. Just to clarify, it's not mine. That's why I enjoy it so much. But my grandfather is still traumatized by what happened. After retiring from the police force, my grandfather worked for a while as a night watchman at a cemetery in the town where he used to live. There were only 2 of them on the night shift, him and his partner, Ramon. They were hired because The cemetery had been robbed multiple times, and Ramon couldn't handle it alone. On his first night, Ramon showed him around and marked all the areas of the cemetery on a map. It seemed easy, but it wasn't. There were dangers in the area, which is why they were there. Ramon explained that sometimes people would steal clothes, jewelry, or valuables from the deceased, and in one case, they even stole an entire body. At midnight, my grandfather began his rounds. He took his flashlight and a baton for protection, and he also carried a firearm. He started his walk through the cold cemetery, the wind blowing through the tombstones and the darkness enveloping everything. He walked through the children's section without any issues, though he felt a very strange energy. When he reached the adult section, he began to hear a faint voice in the wind. It sounded like someone performing a ritual or praying. My grandfather followed the voice, walking several meters to the right, and there he saw her, a woman kneeling at a grave, burying something. When she realized she'd been spotted, she ran out of the cemetery. My grandfather also ran, but stopped at the tombstone. He brushed aside the dirt with his boot and found ragdolls filled with pins. Deeper down, he found a jar of what looked like jam, but inside was red water with hair, pins, and photos of people. My grandfather didn't touch them. He just kicked them out of the cemetery. These crazy people, my grandfather would say whenever he told this story. He continued his rounds and returned to Ramon, who explained that it was common to see people practicing witchcraft in the cemetery, but Ramon also warned him not to be scared if he saw something else, something like a ghost. My grandfather didn't believe in ghosts. His motto was to fear the living more than the dead. He thought Ramon was crazy and continued doing his job normally. A month later, around mid-October, close to Halloween, my grandfather went to work as usual. Around 2 or 3 a.m., he went out for his rounds. He started at the edges of the cemetery, and as the minutes passed, the night grew colder and the atmosphere began to change. Cemeteries are usually very quiet, with only the sound of the wind, tree branches, crickets, and birds. But as he entered the adult section, all sound disappeared. It was as if time had stopped. No wind, no sound, nothing. Just the sound of his own heartbeat, which began to race because he knew something was wrong. Then he felt a cold hand touch his shoulder and a voice whisper his name in his ear. When he turned around, he saw a dark shadow in front of him, tall, about 2 meters high, like the figure of death itself. My grandfather drew his gun and fired at the shadow, but the bullets passed right through it. Terrified, he ran toward the children's section, but before he got there, he heard the laughter of children, boys and girls, as if they were playing in a park. But this was a cemetery. My grandfather raised his flashlight, but he hadn't even realized it wasn't working. Only the moonlight illuminated the area, and there among the tombstones, he saw the children playing. They were the ones laughing. My grandfather tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He stood there for several minutes, watching the ghostly children, until he felt a hand on his shoulder pulling him back. He screamed, thinking it was death, but when he turned around, he saw Ramon, who carried him back to their quarters. Ramon poured aguardiente on his head and cleaned him with eggs and herbs. My grandfather couldn't move. He was in shock. An hour later, he started feeling sick. Ramon let him leave early, and my grandfather didn't return the next night. He came back in the morning to resign. Ramon insisted he stay, saying that what he experienced was normal, especially in October, when the dead are said to be preparing to visit their families. But my grandfather didn't listen. He knew what he had seen wasn't normal, and he quit. Now his motto is to fear both the living and the dead. I've been a taquero for over 20 years, and in all that time, I've never experienced anything paranormal. But I have friends who have, especially since working late at night exposes you to dangerous and unexplainable things. Let me tell you one story. It was 3 a.m. and my friend was packing up. He was putting away the vegetables when he heard 2 men talking and laughing nearby. Thinking they were customers, he peeked through the hole in his stand but saw no one. He swears he saw two dogs talking like humans, and when he looked, they ran away, laughing. Shocked, he fainted inside the stand. Fortunately, he didn't hit his head hard, and he woke up minutes later. He quickly packed up his things, loaded his truck, and left. I believe him. Out there, we don't understand what happens during the late hours of the night. But I also believe him because whenever he tells this story, he looks terrified and starts trembling. It's a short story, but it's truly terrifying to me. Music. I was coming home from work very late. It was past midnight. I work as an accountant, and that day I had to stay late to finish an urgent report. When I was done, I got on my motorcycle and took my usual route home. Everything was normal until I passed a place called La Labor Vieja, where I've heard strange things happen. My motorcycle started jerking, which was unusual because I always keep it in good condition. I started to panic because I didn't want to get stuck there, so I began praying for protection to make it home safely. Then, in the middle of the dark road, a teenager around 16 years old appeared out of nowhere and crossed the street. I could see his face clearly. It was terrifying. He was pale, disfigured, and had no eyes, just empty sockets. I swerved to avoid him and accelerated as fast as I could to get home. But then I realized he was running after me at an incredible speed. I accelerated even more, and when I reached a section of the road with streetlights, he disappeared. I checked my mirrors, and he was gone. When I got home, I quickly parked my motorcycle and went inside. My wife asked me why I looked so shaken. I told her what had happened, and she prayed for me. I calmed down, but I was still scared. I hope I never run into that thing again. It was a dangerous encounter, and I'm just glad nothing worse happened. What did you think of these stories? Before we end, as a bonus, I'll share an interesting story sent to us by Wern via email. For me, that's all for tonight. See you in the next program. Good night. My grandfather was like a father to me. He guided and advised me for many years. That's why his death hit me so hard. I cried until I thought I had no tears left, but I didn't care. I needed to let out all my pain. The next day, I felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my soul. A year later, around the anniversary of his death on August 31st, which also happens to be my best friend's birthday, I had mixed feelings. On one hand, I was happy knowing he was resting peacefully in a better place, but on the other, I felt a deep sadness and nostalgia. The night before the anniversary, on August 30th, I dreamed of him. In the dream, I was in his room, which was on the first floor of our two-story house. I was wearing pajamas and looking in the mirror. His bathroom was filled with green, vibrant plants, full of life. As I looked in the mirror, I heard his voice clearly saying, "Mija, I'm home." That's how he used to call out when he arrived. I was stunned and didn't respond. A minute later, I heard him again. "Hija, aren't you going to welcome me?" When I realized it was my grandfather, I started trembling with emotion. I ran out of the room, tears streaming down my face. "Abuelito," I shouted. In my dream, he was walking perfectly, something he hadn't been able to do in his final years. He had been bedridden and in poor health, but in the dream he was upright, smiling, and full of life. It was a relief to see him so happy. I hugged him, and it felt so real. Then he started walking down the stairs, and I followed. He stopped in front of his room on the first floor, opened the door, and I asked him what he was doing. He said, "I came to get some things." I was about to ask what things when I heard my grandmother's voice saying, "Hija, I'm home. Who are you talking to?" When I opened my eyes, my grandfather was gone, but the door was left open. I woke up crying, my face wet with tears. I got up quickly, opened my bedroom door, and ran down the stairs, almost falling in the process. When I reached the first floor, the door to my grandfather's room was open, just like in my dream. It had been closed since his death a year ago. My grandmother came out and asked, "Hija, what's wrong?" Still crying, I told her Abuelito was here. When I explained what happened, we hugged and cried together. This paranormal experience was the most beautiful one I've ever had.